Thank you so much. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here for this inaugural event, and I want to thank Lauren for all the work that she's done to help facilitate us getting here, and thank you, the judges and the supporters, for being able to make this happen. It's truly a unique thing. I've never seen it before, and I'm excited to be here. When I heard the Ideas Forum, the Ideas contest, a thought popped in my head that was descriptive of this, and it's actually a quote from the movie Inception. It says, "An idea is highly contagious. Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate." And that's been the case for me with this proposal. This has been almost 4 years in the making for me. In the middle of my second and third year of law school, I first came upon this idea. And I did my best to lobby my then member of Congress, who's no longer the member for my area. He was a Republican. I lobbied a Democratic senator from Virginia as well, because the idea was meant to be bipartisan. But I do believe, since then, I've realized that it is a conservative proposal. And ultimately, I found a vehicle for that, and that is in Congressman Tom Garrett. So I would be remiss if I did not tell y'all that last month, this idea was converted into a bill that was introduced before Congress. It's H.R. 4584. It is the Student Security Act of 2017. It was introduced last month, and since then we've had co-sponsors of Luke Messer, the chairman of the Republican Policy Committee, Mark Meadows, the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, Todd Rokita, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education, and Congressmen Dave Bratt, Drew Ferguson, and Ted Budd, all of which are from the Southeast area, and Congressman Garrett represents Charlottesville, my home. But before I can explain the full details of this bill, I need to explain the underlying problems behind the student debt crisis, which you'll hear about in 2 presentations, I believe, today, as well as a few sticking points about Social Security, things that we are generally aware of, but a few of the details need to be highlighted to fully understand this proposal. William F. Buckley, Jr., in 2007, wrote Affording the Dream, The Trouble with Tuition, and he recognized that the marketplace rule is hogwash when it comes to higher education. The explanations for this are multifarious. And in 2007, he recognized the rise of demand, that being the oversaturation of college degrees, the high level of competition amongst students seeking to go to the best institutions, the costs for faculty and administration going ever so high, and the unlimited course offerings that are required. But since 2007, there have been massive shifts in the student debt market that are also underlying this crisis. Since 2007, nearly 50 million Americans are now burdened with student debt. The college loan balances have risen more than $900 billion since Mr. Buckley issued that statement, and it's now up to nearly $1.5 trillion as of last month. It's the second largest source of personal debt in the United States, behind only mortgages. And the average outstanding balance has now gone up to $34,000, which is a 62% increase since 2007. The percentage of borrowers owing $50,000 or more has tripled. And over 5 million are now in default. And that does not even include those paying zero each month due to various forgiveness plans. And one thing to note later is over $1 billion last year was withheld from over 100,000 Social Security benefit recipients. That's up 540% since 2002. So, what do you do about fixing the student debt problem? To me, there are 2 issues. One, there's the institutional issue of the lending mechanism. Who is the financier? Is it going through the institution? Is it going through the federal government? That's on the front end. But what we need to also recognize is issues on the back end, facing those 50 million Americans, that $1.5 trillion in debt that's crippling our economy. There have been dozens of proposals on the conservative wing of the Republican Party to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, seeking ways to fix the front end. Is there free college, as you've seen maybe in New York, up to a certain level? You've seen Bernie Sanders run on that. Do you cap tuition, which is a very top-down approach, whether that's at the federal level or the state level? Do we go into more conservative principles, such as risk sharing with institutions or income share agreements? And finally, do you open up things like methods to bankruptcy for those who are buried in debt? Or do you fix the interest rates rather than have them reflective of the true risk? Do you cap the interest rates? That is not the focus of my proposal. My focus is not on the front end. My focus is ways to fix the back end and address those for the other 50 million Americans. One thing to realize, though, going forward is the collateral consequences of this debt. It sounds big, but when you break it down into smaller pieces, you learn that home buying has been delayed on average 7 years for those with student loan debt. That's down 35% for those with student debtors. Family development is way down. $10,000 in debt reduces the likelihood of marriage by 11% for men and 17% for women. Every $1,000 in debt held 10 years after graduation reduces your likelihood of marriage by 3.5%. Business development is down, savings and retirement is down, and ultimately the middle class is suffering, and there's higher rates of racial inequality among the impact of student debt. With Social Security, the third rail, as they call it, regarding policy reforms, you just don't go there. Even the Treasury Department has recognized the issues underlying the Social Security system. They recognize that we have over $7 trillion in present value terms of unfunded liabilities. That's equal to about 3 to 3.5% of future taxable payrolls. The only way to fix this issue is through reducing the present value of the benefits or increasing the revenues. Those are the only two ways. That delaying the changes to Social Security reduces the number of cohorts, meaning the generational impact of those who are going to be affected by the time a change is made. And finally, they say there's no way to grow ourselves out of this problem. Growth is good, obviously, and it will help, but there's no way to just simply grow the economy and get us out of the system. There have to be institutional reforms. So what are the solutions to that? Many on the left will say raise the revenues, which is a portion of the issue, just said by the Treasury Department. Does that mean raise the tax rate on your payroll? Does that mean raise the taxable income, which is now capped at roughly $125,000? Do you raise it above that cap? Do you reduce the benefits by raising the age? Do you means test it? Ultimately, do you privatize it? That's something that has always been a dream of conservative thinkers, but even William F. Buckley recognized what conservatives are going to have to get used to is that certain fights we've waged are quite simply lost. It's fine to discuss things of that nature, but ultimately, outside of the walls of a classroom, as he says, people are not going to pay attention to that. So privatization is not what I'm seeking in this bill. As you'll see in the next two slides, and these graphics are significant for what the proposal is about to be, and that is the number one cost on our budget is Social Security. That is the number one cost. It makes up around 33% of spending for the federal government. Whereas as assets, and not revenues yet, but assets, student loans actually are the largest asset on the books of the federal government, making over 50% of their assets as accounts receivable. So what to do? What to do to those two things? I think a quote from Mr. Buckley is good here, and that is, conservatism cannot be blind or give the appearance of being blind to the dismaying spectacle of unemployment or any other kind of suffering. The most serious argument against Social Security has to do with its compulsory character, but very few people, if given the opportunity, would opt for exclusion. So what can we do to incentivize these individuals to opt for exclusion or something similar? That's where the Student Security Act comes in. This act, and at this point, by the way, I know that questions are going to come up later. I encourage you to ask questions from this point forward if they come up, because I would really like the engagement and the communication. It does a better job of explaining it because a lot of people are going to have questions. The first thing would be to provide student debtors with the option of loan forgiveness in exchange for voluntarily raising their qualifying age of Social Security old age benefits. This loan forgiveness program would create a voluntary cut to mandatory spending, and for every $550 in loan forgiveness, a participant would voluntarily raise their full retirement age of Social Security by simply 1 month. That translates to $6,600 for every year, and this plan would cap at $40,000 of forgiveness and a 6-year raise in Social Security. The Social Security Administration has scored this bill and projects a $702 billion net positive score, that's savings, to the federal government. That's roughly 11% of what's necessary to shore up the Social Security fund. This plan would have a sunset provision, which would end within 15 years from enactment, so that Congress could reassess as to whether or not it's necessary going forward. I would argue that there are unique factors in our current federal subsidization of higher education that would most likely dissipate over that 15 years, so hopefully this would not be necessary. For eligibility purposes, only those with federal student loans at this point would be eligible. They'd be eligible for the first 24 months of enactment, all federal debt holders. And then following these first 24 months, only those individuals who are less than 5 years from graduation or full-time student status may enter the program. And that's for purposes of guarding against moral hazard. Those who are more than 5 years out but might not be working 10 years or making the required payments into Social Security where they wouldn't be receiving it on the back end, yet wiping out their debt in the front end. That's to guard against that scenario. Additional considerations, participants would have to forego the actuarial adjustment traditionally granted for delayed benefits. Typically, if you push back your benefits, you're going to have more added to the benefits you're due to receive, on average of $15,000 a year. That would be wiped out for these participants. They would continue paying into Social Security at the normal rate, just as they would be otherwise. They may continue to receive reduced benefits 5 years prior to full-time retirement. So now you can take out early retirement around 62. If your full retirement age is 67, they would continue to be able to do that at the reduced rate, which is around 75%. And then loan forgiveness via student security would not qualify as income for purposes of taxes. One thing that a lot of people do not realize is all these forgiveness plans that are currently in the system, when debt is forgiven, it will be taxed as income. So 15, 20 years from now, when someone is excited that they're wiping out that remaining debt, they're going to have a hefty tax bill coming their way. Additional considerations. This is completely voluntary. If you do not want to take it, you do not have to take it. That is a huge aspect of this bill, something that William F. Buckley referenced very much in the first quote I talked about, and that is the compulsory concept. He even had another quote that said, liberals are, and I'm paraphrasing, but liberals are fine with you doing whatever you want so long as it's compulsory. This is voluntary. Parents and grandparents may enter the program if they are co-signers. There's a significant amount of parents, grandparents who are co-signers. So that means that if a parent sees that, or a grandparent sees that their child or grandchild would benefit from wiping out their loans, and they're in a position where they might not need that Social Security at that point, they can choose to raise their own Social Security retirement age in order to wipe out the debts of the underlying debtor. 90% of all debtors would have the ability to eliminate, and this is not part of the plan, this is just a stat. 90% of debtors have $40,000 or less. Okay? That means 90% of all debtors would have the ability to eliminate 100% of their loans. That's a huge impact. Social Security would align with the adjusted life expectancy. So 6-year raise, that's the maximum you could take in this program. That would bring the life expectancy of Social Security into the 2018 terms, because that's how our life expectancy has risen since it was last set. Social Security disability insurance remains unaffected. So a common critique is, well, what happens if I can't work and you've raised my age and I don't have the retirement? Well, you can either A, take it out early, which I told you is still available, or if you can't work, you should qualify for SSDI, which is a completely separate aspect of the fund. So how does that money work? First thing is all of this is in present value terms. This is not manipulating future value versus present value. These are all in present value terms. The Social Security Administration recognized as such when they scored it. The reason CBO hasn't scored it at this point is because 75 years is outside of their traditional window. They traditionally score things within 10 or maybe 20 if you really push them. But 75-year window is built for Social Security. The average Social Security beneficiary receives $1,300 a month or $16,000 a year. Under this plan, student security is a trade-off of $550 in loan forgiveness now in lieu of $1,300 in monthly benefits. That's $6,600 for the expense of $16,000 in annual Social Security benefits. With the maximum of $40,000 being forgiven, that translates to roughly $95,000 in retirement benefits. That's where you get the $700 billion in savings. Many on the Social Security side would say, well, why would anyone take this plan? That's a bad deal. And they don't understand the impact day to day on the ground level of what student debt is doing to folks. Those with student loans are substantially in favor of some type of relief here. Polls have come, sorry? One minute. Okay, sorry. Polls have come out and stated that 50% of Americans with student debt would give up their right to vote in order to wipe it out. 40% would end their life expectancy 1 year early. 30% would give up an organ. I know that those sound significant, and they are. But ultimately, the types of benefits and collateral benefits this would have serve the same purpose of Social Security, and that is lifetime earnings go up when you have higher education, whether that's at the undergraduate or graduate level. Financial planning starts earlier and you have more financial literacy, and there's less physical demand in your career, which means you don't have to physically retire as early. Now, I would love to open it up to questions from the judges or the crowd.
Well, Elliott, this is very well done. I have a ton of questions, and not that I would speak for Bill, but even if I disagreed, and I disagree with some of this plan, I think Bill Buckley would be thrilled to have such a thoughtful plan put out. But let me put on a populist hat, and it might even be my own hat. I'm Catholic. I was fruitful and multiplied. I have 5 children. They've all gone to UConn. Their sap of a father saved his money, lived a very impoverished life in order to save for his children, so they would not have to take out any school loans, and they didn't. And so that's my story, and you want me, essentially, or American society, to pay for elites to go to very expensive private colleges. So address that kind of nasty but loving comment.
So, I would address that in 2 ways. First of all, you as the father of 5 who paid their way, who worked hard for it, you're not paying for the program participant. The program participant is paying for it themselves long-term over their FICA. This is effectively an income-based repayment through FICA. And by raising their age and eliminating their future benefits, they're paying for that over the next 30 to 40 years of their work life. So they're paying for it, not you. This isn't free college, right? That's how a more socialized proposal of free college, that's the plan that I think you have described, where everybody's paying for that one individual. I agree with you. I think that that is a fundamental flawed program, not just from a populist standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. I'd also say for those who work their way through, whether that's the student or the parent, those who don't have debt, those who are 15, 20 years out of school, and they said, well, I had to pay my way, that's fine. They get to keep their Social Security currently at a lower rate, right? They're not forced to make that sacrifice. Not that anyone in this plan would be forced to do anything, but they're not facing the type of economic pressures that would force one to give up their long-term benefits. So to that end, you're seeing the solvency of their own Social Security go up.
If I'm just maybe we have a rebuttal question, or just a quick follow, not to steal from my colleagues, but college is a choice, and people make choices based on affordability. And now this opens a vaster field of affordability and self-impoverishment in a way by paying for a private school when you may only be able to, have the means, real means to go to state school or even no school, So anyway, that's...
Well, to that end, and that was to the earlier point in the presentation, that is, there are fundamental issues with the current affordability system of the institution level. There have been dozens of proposals as to how to address that, and that is a requirement long-term. That is not built into this bill. This bill is for those who are already encumbered, right? But as far as whether or not people should go to the private school, the public school, no school, whether they should go into trade schools, whether the cost should be going down and how, those are different proposals. At the front end of the system, this is more built for the 50 million that have already gone through a flawed structure. But I agree with you 100%. Things need to be addressed at the front end. Not everybody needs to be going to a 4-year liberal arts school.
Well, I'm delighted to share time. I don't have a pressing question, but to the extent that we are talking about college, we have seen the proliferation of some of the delightful things like underwater basket weaving for feminist, marginalization studies, and nonsense of that sort in elite, expensive private colleges. And part of what has started to exert some sort of rationality, or at least the hope for some of that in the future, is this sense that this debt is not going to have a proportionate return in the real world. And do you have any sort of concern that a program like this that allows people to sort of escape the near-term consequences of bad choices? And we all know how young people are. I mean, when I'm 65, as I begin to approach that age, it does not seem quite as distant as it once did, but I remember very well being 22, and it seemed as though that will never happen. I really needn't worry about that, and therefore I can pursue my underwater basket weaving and feminist marginalization studies without any real near-term repercussions. Do you worry about the absence of any sort of pressure in that sense with the sort of the near-term punishment of debt being removed?
No, it kind of goes to his question a little bit, and that is, first of all, yes, absolutely. If the front end is not fixed, if the system as we know it is not changed, this could have very perverse incentives, okay, just to your point, and that is someone goes, they spend 5 years, they're spring breaking to Cancun, they rack up the debt, and then they wipe it all out as soon as they walk out, and they push back their retirement age. That is a very big concern, that the institutional reforms have to take place. Congress is moving in that way. States are very much a part of that, and institutions themselves are going that direction. This bill's not meant to address the front-end financial reforms that are necessary, but I'll also say that sacrifice is already being pressured on the younger cohorts. The can continues to be kicked down the road. Thankfully, this proposal has started the conversation in a different way. It's not the same old method of raise the age, raise the taxes, do this, do that. It is, how can we grease the skids here so that we can start moving towards mandatory spending reform? This is a way to leverage the predicament that has already been suffered into people wanting to do something that needs to happen anyway. And so I would address that.
Great. Thank you. I'm just going to do a quick one, and then I think we'll open it up. Elliott, great stuff. Super interesting thinking. I'm going to put the hard work on you and ask if you could argue against your bill for a half a minute, specifically on unintended consequences that might, where's the downside?
So the biggest downside would be if Congress saw that this was working and did it with every form of debt owed to the federal government. Because what happens if that becomes your taxes? What happens if that becomes restitution? What happens if that becomes, and you can pick it, right? What happens if they open up every form of debt and say, yeah, we're going to liquidate your future entitlements and turn this in? But I can't guard against that. We also can't guard against Congress raiding Social Security in 30 years period and just not cutting checks anymore either. I mean, at the end of the day, if the federal government wants to seize the means they have that power, and that's the underlying problem with the collectivization system that we already have. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say, and that's the easiest way to rail against it, is to say you're stealing people's retirement. They should already be able to have their debts forgiven, right? That is a more socialist viewpoint. I personally obviously disagree with that. And then finally, the last thing would be the pay for. This would require, and this is down in the weeds, but this would require this program to go off budget for probably 15 years. The duration of the program, as far as the debt, would have to go off budget, which Reagan administration took stuff on and off. LBJ started the practice, but this one thing would have to be, because it is it's a leveraged buyout long term. They are leveraging this current asset, which is their largest asset, in order to reduce their long-term exposure on their number one costs. So it would, this portion would have to go off for 15 years.
There's one right behind. There was one.
Yes, sir.
This is the only form of debt that I know of that you cannot declare bankruptcy. And I think you've got to do a program like this, or you have to allow students to declare bankruptcy. Otherwise, you have a form of debtor's prison, a modern form of debtor's prison.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. What's ironic here is both parties in this transaction are facing bankruptcy. They're both insolvent. By definition, when you walk out of school, if you have debt, you're insolvent, right? The same way that the government has $20 trillion. They have multiple trillions in unfunded liabilities. This is a trade-off that long-term helps the government. I agree with you. The other two forms are taxes that are owed or criminal restitution. So they're treating students as if they're tax evaders or criminals. And if bankruptcy were to be introduced, the market would liquidate. I mean, it would be overnight. It would be a massive collapse. That's why it hasn't been the bubble that everyone wants to compare it to, because in the mortgage crisis, people could, and they did, take out bankruptcy. Corporations did too. Students can't do that. I'm more than willing to take more questions, but I don't know how the time is.
I think we're out of time,
Okay.
so please join me in.
Terrific.
Yeah.